All right, everybody, buckle up. Because today we are really diving deep, talking about the right-wing environmental agenda.
Yeah.
And you weren't kidding when you said this book, Liberal Losers,
Right.
by Moses Seenarine, really gets into it.
It does.
We're just doing excerpts today,
Right.
but even the excerpts are giving me, like, a lot to think about, so this is going to be a good one, I can tell already.
It's a fascinating read. It really digs deep into not just, like, the talking points, but, like, the history, the intellectual history of how these views came to be.
And that's what I'm really interested in. Like, how far back are we going here? Is this like a Reagan era thing?
It's even further back than that, actually.
Oh, wow.
Seenarine makes a really compelling case that those oil crises back in the 70s, remember those gas lines?
Oh, yeah.
Those left a really big mark on the conservative psyche.
That makes sense because it's like that vulnerability of being dependent on other nations for your energy.
Exactly.
Like, that really hits home.
That fear of energy dependence is, I think, a major driver behind, what you see in the book is this big push for energy independence.
Which leads us to, I mean, he spends a lot of time on this, like ANWR,
Right.
the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, drilling there. And it's not just about, like, we need more oil. It's about we need to control the oil.
Exactly.
You need to be the ones in charge of it.
It's about control and security, exactly.
So, but it's not just about getting more oil out of the ground, right?
Right.
He also talks about this whole concept of market-based solutions, which I'll admit that sounds kind of jargony to me.
It does sound jargony, but the idea is actually fairly simple.
Okay.
Which is basically, instead of having the government come in with a lot of regulations and telling people what to do, you use market forces to try to solve the problems.
So, like, incentivize people to go green?
Exactly.
Like, make it financially beneficial to do the right thing.
Exactly.
So, yes.
So cap and trade is a really good example.
Okay.
A government sets a cap, hence the name, on the amount of emissions that are allowed, and then they issue permits to companies that allow them to pollute a certain amount.
Okay.
And then those companies can buy and sell permits to each other.
So, like, if I'm a company that can easily cut down, I can then sell my permits to somebody who's having more trouble.
Exactly.
Interesting. So it's like you still put a limit on it, but you let the market figure out how to get there.
Exactly.
Okay, so there's got to be some downsides to this, though, right?
Of course there are, yeah. And Seenarine talks about those, too.
But good.
One of the main ones being that it could actually worsen existing inequalities.
How so?
So think about those cap and trade systems, right? Companies in wealthier areas could just buy up more permits, which allows them to pollute more.
Oh, so they just pollute and then they just pay the fine, basically, or pay for the permit.
Exactly, but then industries in poorer areas get squeezed out. They can't afford the permits.
So it's not actually fixing the problem, it's just shifting where the pollution's happening.
Exactly.
And that kind of ties into what we were talking about with environmental justice, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
It's like it disproportionately affects different communities.
Yeah, and that's a theme that you see throughout the book.
So we've got this backdrop of energy independence, market-based solutions, but we haven't even touched Project 2025 yet, which sounds like a sci-fi movie.
Right.
But it's actually a big part of, from what I understand, like the current conservative environmental playbook.
It is, and it's one of the most controversial aspects of the book.
Really?
Yeah.
So break it down. What is Project 2025?
So Project 2025 is essentially a policy roadmap put together by a bunch of conservative think tanks, and it really outlines a very different approach to environmental issues.
Okay, like how different are we talking?
Well, for one thing, they call for a very significant downsizing, if not complete elimination, of key environmental agencies like the EPA.
Wow.
Potentially even NOAA.
NOAA, the hurricane people.
Yeah. The ones who warn us about tsunamis and all that.
Wow.
Yeah, pretty major.
That's a bold move.
It is.
Okay.
And Seenarine suggests that this is because they essentially see these agencies as obstacles to their vision.
So it's about shrinking the role of government when it comes to this.
Exactly. It's a very different philosophy.
Okay.
And that difference in philosophy really extends to their approach to climate change, which is something he talks about a lot in the book.
And that's what I really wanted to get into, because when we talk about the right-wing environmental agenda, it feels like that's where like the biggest gulf is between like that side and more progressive environmentalists.
Right.
So how does he unpack that?
Yeah, it's not so black and white. He actually argues that there's kind of a spectrum of views within conservative circles when it comes to climate change.
Oh, really? So it's not like they all just deny it outright.
Exactly. You'll have some conservatives who are like, yep, climate change is real human cause. We need to address it.
Okay.
And then you have others who might say like, yeah, maybe it's real, but the science isn't settled on how bad it'll be or whether we can even do anything about it.
Gotcha. So like a range of how urgent they think it is.
Exactly. And then, of course, you have those who just flat out deny it.
Right, right.
But what's interesting is even among those who acknowledge it, the solutions they propose can look very different from what you might see from folks on the left.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, you don't see a lot of conservatives rallying behind the Green New Deal or anything like that.
Exactly. For instance, Seenarine points out that while some conservatives might support, limited government-led environmental initiatives, they tend to be very wary of those big international agreements, like the Paris Agreement.
Ah, the Paris Agreement. Yeah, that was a whole thing, wasn't it, when the U.S. pulled out of that?
It was a big deal.
And Seenarine seems to suggest that a big part of that decision stemmed from this deep distrust of what some conservatives see as globalism.
Exactly. They worry about these agreements eroding national sovereignty, imposing unfair burdens on American businesses.
So it all comes back to economics again.
In a way, yeah, it's about that balance between environmental concerns and economic interest and how much they're willing to compromise one for the other.
Which, even when we're talking about domestic policy, Seenarine points out that a lot of conservative approaches to climate change really emphasize deregulation and those market-driven solutions over what they might see as like heavy-handed government intervention.
Exactly. It's that whole idea that the free market can solve anything, that if we just unleash the power of innovation and individual choice, we can address climate change without resorting to all these burdensome regulations.
Right, it's that invisible hand argument.
Precisely. But, of course, critics would argue that when it comes to something as complex and urgent as climate change, relying solely on the market is like bringing a knife to a gunfight.
Yeah, you can't just hope for the best with something like this.
Exactly. And Seenarine does a good job of presenting those counter-arguments, too.
Okay, good, because I was wondering if we were going to get to those.
Oh, yeah, he highlights the potential pitfalls of this approach. For example, he points out that those market-based solutions like cap and trade, while good, in theory, can be really tough to actually implement in a way that's both effective and fair.
Like we were talking about earlier, how those wealthier companies could just buy their way out of it.
Exactly. There's always that risk of loopholes or disproportionate impacts on more vulnerable communities.
And how do you even put a price tag on carbon emissions in a way that actually reflects the true cost to the environment?
Right. Like, is there even such a thing as a high enough price?
So it's not just about whether or not we should act, but how we act.
Exactly. And Seenarine really drives that point home.
Okay, so it sounds like he's really laying out both sides of this debate.
He is. And he doesn't shy away from showing how starkly different the conservative and liberal approaches can be.
Give me an example.
Well, like, when it comes to energy, conservatives might be gung-ho about expanding nuclear power, investing in carbon capture technologies, things like that.
Which are kind of seen as like Band-Aid solutions by some environmentalists, right?
It's exactly. Whereas liberals might be pushing for massive investments in renewable energy, stricter emissions standards for vehicles, big picture systemic changes.
So it's like two completely different toolboxes for tackling the same problem.
Exactly. And choosing the right tools for the job is crucial, which is something Seenarine really emphasizes.
So it's not just about the policies themselves, it's about the thought process behind them.
Exactly. And he doesn't just focus on the policy debates. He also digs into the forces that are shaping those debates.
Like what?
Well, he has a whole chapter dedicated to exploring the role of conservative media and how they frame environmental issues.
Oh, boy. Yeah, because you can't really talk about this stuff without addressing the media, can you?
Right. And Seenarine argues that conservative media outlets have had a huge influence on public opinion, especially when it comes to climate change.
Like how?
Well, they've been known to amplify those dissenting voices, the ones who question the science or downplay the urgency.
Right, like framing it as this debate within the scientific community when there really isn't one.
Exactly. And they often frame environmental regulations as being bad for the economy, job killers, all that.
Which plays right into that whole jobs versus the environment narrative.
Exactly. But as Seenarine points out, it's not always that black and white.
Because you can have both, right?
Exactly. He actually argues that investing in clean energy and environmental protection can lead to job creation, innovation, long-term economic growth.
It's about changing the narrative, showing that a healthy environment and a strong economy aren't mutually exclusive.
Exactly. In fact, they're intertwined. You need one to have the other.
It's like that saying, there's no economy on a dead planet.
Exactly. And Seenarine stresses that this shift in perspective isn't just about policy changes. It requires a fundamental shift in mindset.
So how do we do that? How do we get people to see that environmental stewardship isn't at odds with economic progress, but rather essential for it.
Well, that's where the rubber meets the road and where seenarine starts to lay out what he sees as a more viable path forward.
Okay, so what does he propose? What's his alternative vision? Right, lay it on us. What's the alternative?
Okay, so if the right-wing approach is kind of like hands off, let the market do its thing, seenarine's vision is more like we need to be proactive.
Okay, I'm into that. Proactive.
Yeah, he lays out this three-pronged approach: carbon pricing, green infrastructure investments, and then a really strong regulatory framework.
Okay, let's break those down. Carbon pricing, what does that even mean?
So basically, you make polluters pay for the environmental damage they cause.
Okay, so like a fine.
Kind of, but it's more like you're putting a price tag on carbon emissions.
I see, so it's not free to pollute anymore.
Right, and that creates a financial incentive for companies to reduce their carbon footprint, right? Because it hurts their bottom line.
So we're talking like carbon taxes, cap and trade, those kinds of things.
Exactly.
Okay.
With the carbon tax, the government sets a price per ton of carbon emitted, and then boom, that gets added to the cost of like burning fossil fuels.
So it makes cleaner options more appealing, price-wise?
Exactly.
And cap and trade, that's the one where there's a limit on emissions and companies can buy and sell permits?
Those permits become like a commodity, basically.
Interesting.
Their price goes up or down based on supply and demand. So companies that are able to reduce their emissions can actually profit by selling their permits.
Okay, so it's kind of like a market-based solution, but with the government stepping in to make sure emissions actually go down.
Right. It's like setting the ground rules, but then letting the market figure out the most efficient way to get there.
And what does seenarine say about the money that would be generated from these carbon pricing things?
Oh, that's the best part. He suggests using it to fund even more environmental initiatives.
I like the way this guy thinks.
Right. It's like a win-win.
Okay, so what kind of initiatives are we talking about here?
Well, that brings us to his second point. Green infrastructure.
Okay.
Think like renewable energy, public transportation, energy-efficient buildings, those smart grids everyone's talking about, stuff like that.
So like building a future where we don't even need fossil fuels as much.
Exactly. It's not just about cleaning up the mess we've made. It's about creating a system that's sustainable for the long haul.
I like that.
And the best part is all of this, the renewable energy sector, the green building sector, that's where the jobs of the future are.
Right. It's like we've been saying, a healthy environment and a strong economy, they go hand in hand.
Exactly. You can't have one without the other.
Okay, so we've got carbon pricing, we've got green infrastructure. What's the third prong?
So the third piece is a strong regulatory framework.
Okay, so now the government's getting involved.
Well, seenarine's argument is that while market forces are great and all, you need some rules in place just to make sure everyone's playing fair.
So like stricter emission standards for cars and factories, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Making sure companies are held accountable for polluting, enforcing environmental laws, that kind of thing.
Okay, so kind of a balancing act because too much regulation can stifle innovation, but too little, and companies can get away with murder.
Exactly. It's about finding that sweet spot, right? Where you're protecting the environment without putting a stranglehold on the economy.
Right, which is easier said than done.
Totally. But that's where, informed citizens come in.
Okay, how so?
Seenarine really emphasizes that none of this is going to happen without people demanding it.
That's true. Politicians don't usually do anything unless they're forced to.
Right. It's on us to hold their feet to the fire, to push for the changes we want to see in the world.
So it's not just about voting every 4 years, it's about staying engaged.
Right? Contacting your representatives, supporting organizations that align with your values, all of that.
So basically, we all need to become environmental activists in our own way.
In a way, yeah, because the future of the planet really does depend on it.
Well, that's a sobering thought to end on.
It is, but it's also empowering.
Right, because it means we have a say in this.
Exactly. We're not powerless.
That's a good reminder. So we've covered a lot of ground today, the ins and outs of the right-wing environmental agenda, what seenarine proposes as a different way forward, and most importantly, what we can all do to create a more sustainable future.
It's been quite the deep dive.
It has. But if there's one thing I hope you take away from this conversation, it's that you have a voice. And your actions, no matter how small they may seem, can actually make a difference.
Here,
That's all for today's deep dive. Thanks for listening, everyone.